Brad Edwards. I hope you're having a great day. Welcome into the game in T-Town.
Yeah, all's good here. Getting closer and closer to kickoff. So, it's a little different when you're not dialed into one team, so you can focus on the positive.
Gotcha.
But in your situation, you have no way to avoid the negative at times like this.
Well, and I always say from August to January, Nick Saban sort of dictates the news, determines what we talk about between February through August or the latter part of July. The conversations, you kind of drive the conversation, but it's a medical day. We got DJ Dell, starting nose guard, out with a sprained knee. Dylan Moses out, missed just a slight injury there. But the big one is your middle linebacker, the guy which is going to be your fifth-year senior, who was going to be your signal caller. You just don't grow those on trees. Fifth-year senior, has been in the system, knows the defense. That's a difficult guy to replace.
Yeah, and you've probably heard Saban say it. I know I've heard him say it. Is that he doesn't worry about having to replace starters as much as he worries about having to replace leaders. And even though McMillan is a guy who hadn't really started, but he, like you said, been on the team, a senior, and a guy who probably was in some capacity of leadership there. And when you are getting this close to the start of the first game and you take a guy like that off the field, other people are going to have to fill that void. And so it could be one of those that just, a presence of someone with experience who knows what he's doing, losing that could be, just as important as losing his ability.
And let me also update, Nick Saban just sent out a statement via the media relation department, a statement on Joshua McMillan, even though it was reported by AL.com. Josh McMillan suffered an injury to his right knee Saturday that will require surgery and keep him out for an indefinite period. We have a great medical staff here, and we'll have full support of everyone in the organization as he goes through the rehab process. We are confident Josh will make a full recovery, end quote, Nick Saban. And you hate it for a fifth-year senior because his eligibility currently is done. When you talk about that, he could possibly get a medical red shirt. I'm sure they'll try to apply for a hardship waiver, and hopefully those things like that are granted. But you're an engineer guy. You may just – you don't know exactly where he's thinking football-wise. Yeah. He may say, forget it, man, I'm going to go make $130,000 solving puzzles. So
That's always a possibility, and good for him if he has that option. But it's still disappointing. Now we don't know for sure that he's out for the season. Had a couple of these 2 years ago where we thought they were out for the season, and then they're back in the Iron Bowl. So you never know. I'm not sure that we'll ever get full details of what's going on and what the timetable is, but I'm sure word will kind of leak out as you start to get into October as to what the likelihood is that someone could make it back from any sort of preseason injury.
Brad, when you look at Alabama going into this fall camp, and we kind of learned about these positions, but as you look at this offensive and defensive line, they're going big and physical. I think they're going back to maybe some of the basics of running the football on the offensive line. They're about a 327 average across. They're massive. They're beast. They got 21 guys who weigh over 300 pounds on this roster in Tuscaloosa. It's a point of emphasis for Alabama to go back and maybe establish running the football a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'm a little curious as to how he's going to do this because I don't think there's any question, given what's returning on offense. You don't need to fix anything. Obviously, if you put those guys back out there and let them sling the ball around the way they were doing last year, they're going to score a ton of points, and you're going to win most of, if not all, of your games. And so this kind of leads me to think that Saban's playing the long game here instead of the short game, which is, recognizing that, hey, you get late in the season against the best defenses you're going to face. Just being able to throw the ball really well is not going to be enough by itself. You're going to have times where you need to run the ball, and they need to be able to do that better than they did a year ago. And I'm guessing that that's what this is all about. Also, as we know, the up-tempo offense and, scoring a lot of points really fast is great, but it's going to put your defense back on the field, with a lot less rest than you're accustomed to. And I think that's the other goal in being able to run the ball, is that when you get to those points in a big game where you want to just milk that clock, allow the defense to rest a little bit more, keep the other team's offense off the field, that you can do that. If you need to kind of shift into that gear, I think we saw Alabama, do that in stretches against Oklahoma after they got up by 3 or 4 touchdowns. Kind of went into that mode, and so I think that's what he wants to be able, to do when he gets against a good team and he has a lead. And you just wonder, is it going to prevent the offense from being everything that it could be? But once again, it's not about setting records and putting up the big numbers that at least you're not trying to put up as big a numbers you possibly can. You're trying to win as many games as you can, and especially the ones in December and January.
Brad, let's stay in the SEC and stay in this side of the division for a couple of minutes. Are you buying LSU? Are you buying that this team is going to be a team that may finish second in the SEC West with a chance to come to Tuscaloosa? Depends on how the game's prior. But are you buying LSU? Because it's a big salesman pitch in this part of the region here.
Yeah, I am. I am buying them. And I think when you look at their schedule, the only game that really jumps out at you is one that they should have trouble winning is the game in Tuscaloosa. And outside of that, just think about it. They don't play Georgia. Okay. So, even if you count the Alabama game as a loss, which we all know it's not a 100% that it's a loss. They have some sort of chance in that game, and we'll know better when it gets closer. But the rest of them, I think they get some good draws as far as who they get at home and who they get on the road. If they're able to win at Texas in week 2, which I like them in that game because Texas is a team that's returning like 8 starters from last year. So it's a good time to get Texas early in the year. I think LSU is in a position where if they can only lose at Alabama and go 11-1, provided the Alabama game is competitive, we've seen that's important to the selection committee. I think if you're 11-1, your only loss is in Tuscaloosa, you've got a chance, depending on what happens in the other conferences. And so I think LSU's got a good chance of being in that position.
So going to Texas game here, because you think about brand against brand, SEC, believes that this brand of football is better than that brand of football. I mean, there's a lot on stake. I mean, you talk about Coach O against Tom Herman and the rivalry there. I think there's some bad blood, or at least that's what I've been told when you talk about those two. I mean, it's brand against brand. It's going to be a fun one out in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, and of course, Texas isn't your vintage Big 12 team. They're not the high-flying offense that don't play defense that you kind of associate with a lot of the Big 12. They are, they're going to be more physical to line of scrimmage, and typically up front defensively. Although they've got some important players they have to replace there, and that's why I said I think getting them, week 2 is a big deal. And to me, I think the key for LSU this season, and all your listeners know, I mean, going back more than 10 years now, like the inside joke in the SEC is always LSU quarterback. That outside of 1 year with Zach Mettenberger, and we found out later 2 all-world wide receivers he was throwing to, they've been very disappointing in the passing game. And a lot of those have had to do with that. The quarterback is just not as talented as they have every other position on the field. And so I think Joe Burrow could be better than people think. I'm not saying he's, on Tua's level or on Jake Fromm's level. But I think as far as him being better than what LSU has had for most of the last 10 years at that position, I think he very well could be that. And depending on what happened, we've all heard the talk before. I have no idea how much they're really going to open their offense. But as long as he's very efficient, then we know LSU has the talent to win. Let's put it this way: they can out-talent almost everyone on their schedule as long as they don't go out there and beat themselves. And I think that's what you're going to get from Joe Burrow. You're going to get a guy who's not going to make the big mistake that's going to help a less talented team be able to beat LSU. Like I said, I like their chances, and especially in that game against Texas, because Texas is going to have a lot more inexperienced guys on that field than LSU will.
Brad Edwards, ESPN college football analyst, ESPN radio that you hear here on Tide 100.9 in Tuscaloosa and throughout this part of the state of Alabama. Brad, let me give you the flexibility to go anywhere you can go. Give me a sleeper team out there that Brad Edwards likes that may make an impact, could be a difference maker in 2019. Somebody out there that maybe not getting the attention that they deserve that you look at, you go, hey, I like this football team? Anybody out there?
Yeah, that depends on what you mean by sleeper. If you're talking about having some sort of outside shot to make the playoff, I would probably go with Utah.
Ooh.
And I would. They're not a sleeper on the conference level. They were in the conference championship game last year. I expect them to win the Pac-12 South again and be back there this year. And in fact, I believe they were actually picked by the Pac-12 media to win the conference. Really, really close between them and Oregon and Washington. But the question is, can anyone in the Pac-12 get through the conference championship game with fewer than 2 losses? Because that's what they're going to have to do to make the playoff. And I don't love Utah's chance to do that, but if you're giving me a whole list with odds of teams to make the playoff, I'd probably feel more confident in making that bet than pretty much anything else on that list. Now, if you want to talk about a team that just is picked to finish much lower in the league by a lot of people, I would go with Baylor. I don't think Baylor's going to win the Big 12, but the format of the Big 12, because they don't have division, is the top 2 teams make the conference championship game, and I think Baylor has a decent chance to be there. Their schedule sets up really well, where the best teams in that league all come to Waco, and I think they're good enough that with home field in those important games, they've got a shot to beat Texas. They've got a above average shot to beat Iowa State. And even if you don't beat Oklahoma, if you can just beat those other 2, then I think you could end up in the conference championship game. So Baylor's a team that I like to have a lot more wins than most people would probably think. Just kind of looking at where they've typically been picked in these preseason polls.
Brad, there's a lot of hype coming out of Ann Arbor. Are you buying?
Yeah, see, and I don't know if I'm necessarily buying Michigan as much as I'm just undecided on Ohio State. The combination of 3 things is what kind of made me lean toward Michigan to win the Big Ten. One is that the game between those 2 teams is in Ann Arbor. But I think the other 2 are more important, which are that Ohio State just lost a first ballot Hall of Fame head coach, and they're replacing him with a guy who has 3 games of head coaching experience. And I realize that's very similar to what happened at Oklahoma 2 years ago, and it's worked out really well for the Sooners. But I think that's the exception to the rule. I'm not saying Ryan Day is not going to do well there, but just in year 1, for you to expect that there's not going to be any drop-off, then I think that might be wishful thinking. Now, look, there were problems with Urban Meyer's health, and I know that had to affect the team and stuff like that. So maybe just not having that cloud will kind of wipe out all the other issues with inexperience. But then, speaking of inexperience, the other problem that they have at Ohio State is quarterback, not because of talent, but because of inexperience. And you're going from a quarterback in Dwayne Haskins, who had arguably the greatest statistical passing season in Big Ten history last year, to a guy in Justin Fields, who, look, on the recruiting front, you would say has more physical talent than Haskins, who was just a first-round pick, but he's never started a college football game. And so, look, we were just talking about LSU. Look at LSU, look at Florida. I think you could even look at Alabama to some extent and see the number of times you can sign a guy who's a 5-star recruit at quarterback, and he doesn't end up being as good as everyone thought. And I think until we see the results in the field, the jury's still out on Fields as well. So I think those 3 things combined, new coach, inexperienced quarterback, and the game being at Michigan are what lead me to lean toward Michigan winning the Big Ten instead of Ohio State. I'd be really surprised if anyone other than those 2 teams won it.
Brad Edwards, I'm going to ask you the final question. ESPN.com's got a great article today ranking the top 50 players in college football. If I gave you a pick and you could select anybody, regardless of classification, who's the number 1 player in college football according to Brad Edwards?
Trevor Lawrence.
Ooh.
And look, he has a smaller sample size because we've seen him for 1 season. And granted, they didn't play a lot of teams in that season that were good enough to beat them or good enough to even give him trouble. But against the best teams he faced, he was great. You couldn't ask anything more. And to me, the difference between him and Tua right now is that we have seen Tua struggle in a couple of big games. And I realize injury was a factor in at least one of those. So you might be able to kind of make a little bit of an excuse for Tua, but you don't have to make an excuse for anything that Trevor Lawrence didn't do. And so I think, to me, that's what breaks the tie, is that I don't yet have any weakness I can point to in his game or any failure to perform on any stage. And because of that, I don't know how you could go with anyone else at this point. Until we see him fail, I don't know how you could go elsewhere.
Brad Edwards, ESPN college football analyst, ESPN Radio, ESPN.com, part of the Stats and Information Group. As always, Brad, we thank you so much for being a part of the show in Tuscaloosa. I hope you have a great week, man.
Okay, thanks. You too, Ryan.